The morning sun crawled over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows across the frost-covered meadow. Martha Brennan stood on her cabin porch, a steaming cup of chicory coffee warming her weathered hands. At 38, she had lived alone on this mountain slope for nearly 7 years now, and the townsfolk down in Copper Creek had plenty to say about it. "That Brennan woman," they whispered in the general store, voices dropping low and discussing her peculiar ways. "Never took another man after losing her family. Lives up there like some hermit, won't let nobody pass her door." Martha knew what they said on her monthly trips for supplies. She caught the sideways glances, heard the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered Muller's store. The men would tip their hats polite enough, but their wives clutched their shawls tighter, as if her solitude might be catching. Truth was, Martha preferred it this way. Her small holding provided everything she needed: a vegetable garden that caught the morning sun, a dozen chickens that laid regular, 2 milk cows, and knowledge of every healing herb that grew wild on the mountainside. She'd learned the plants from her mother, back when life had held different promises. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at: a single room with a stone fireplace, a bed in the corner behind a worn calico curtain, a rough-hewn table and chairs her late husband James had made with his own hands. But it was hers. Built strong enough to weather the harsh Montana winters, far enough from town to avoid unwanted visitors. She sipped her coffee and watched her breath cloud in the cold air. First frost meant she needed to finish harvesting the late squash, pull the last of the carrots, and prepare her root cellar for the long months ahead. Living alone meant doing a man's work and a woman's too, but she'd grown strong these 7 years. Her hands, once soft from tending babies and making biscuits, now bore calluses from axe handles and plow reins. "Morning, Buttercup," she called to her yellow cow, who lowed in response from the small barn. The animals knew her routine well: milking at dawn, feeding the chickens, checking the fence line for breaks. Simple work that kept her hands busy and her mind from wandering to places better left alone. It was while collecting eggs that she found herself thinking about the letter tucked in her Bible. Her sister Rose, living comfortable back east, writing again about finding a new husband, starting over. "You're still young enough," Rose had penned in her careful script. "No sense wasting away on that mountain like some dried-up spinster." Martha snorted at the memory. Rose didn't understand. How could she? Rose hadn't held 3 children as fever took them one by one. Hadn't watched her husband waste away from the same sickness, helpless despite all herbs and prayers. Rose still believed in second chances, in hearts mending like torn fabric. By noon, Martha had filled 2 baskets with the last garden harvest and hung bundles of sage and yarrow from the cabin rafters to dry. The familiar work steadied her, each task a small victory against the wilderness that constantly tried to reclaim her cleared land. She was splitting kindling when she heard horses on the trail below. Her hand tightened on the axe handle. Visitors were rare and rarely welcome. Through the trees, she made out 2 riders, their mounts picking careful steps up the rocky path. Martha recognized them as they drew closer. Tom Harper and his boy Luke from the Double J Ranch, their spread bordering her property to the south. Tom had tried courting her that first year after James died, bringing fresh beef and offers to help with the heavy work. She'd turned him away, gentle but firm, and he'd eventually married the widow Carlson instead. "Afternoon, Mrs. Brennan," Tom called, touching his hat brim. The boy, maybe 16 now, stayed quiet beside his father. "Mr. Harper." Martha didn't set down the axe. "Something I can do for you?" "Just passing through, checking our fence line. Thought we'd see if you needed anything before the snow flies." "I manage fine, thank you." Quote. Tom shifted in his saddle, his weathered face showing discomfort. "Ma'am, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but folks in town are talking. That new preacher, Reverend Dalton, he's been saying things about women living improper, alone and such." Martha's jaw tightened. "And what business is it of his or anyone else's how I live?" "None at all, in my thinking. Just thought you should know. Some of the men been drinking and talking foolish, saying maybe you need looking after, whether you want it or not." The threat hung in the cold air between them. Martha had heard such talk before, how a woman alone was either a witch or a temptation. Certainly not natural. The fact that she'd never taken another man to her bed seemed to offend them more than if she'd taken a dozen. "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Harper, but I've got a Henry rifle and know how to use it. Any man comes up here uninvited will learn that quick enough." Tom nodded, unsurprised. "I figured as much. Just wanted you to know. Me and some of the other ranchers, we don't hold with forcing things on folks. You need help, real help, you send word." After they left, Martha stood long moments staring at the trail. 7 years she'd built this life, healing when folks needed her skills, trading herbs and vegetables for what she couldn't grow or make. 7 years of proving a woman could stand alone. As afternoon shadows grew long, she carried water from the spring, her shoulders aching from the yoke's weight. Inside the cabin, she built up the fire and set beans to soak for tomorrow's supper. The familiar routine couldn't quite shake Tom Harper's warning from her mind. She took down her husband's rifle from above the mantel, checking its action, counting ammunition. James had taught her to shoot straight back when they'd first homesteaded, and wolves still roamed bold. The weapon felt heavy in her hands, but she had defended what was hers before, against claim jumpers, against wandering drunks, against loneliness itself. Night fell early this time of year. Martha lit her single lamp and settled by the fire with her mending. The wedding ring quilt on her bed needed patching, worn thin from 7 winters. As her needle worked, she found herself humming an old hymn her mother used to sing. The sound of her own voice startled her to silence. When had she last sung? When had she last spoken to anyone beyond the necessary words of trade and business? The animals didn't count, though she talked to them plenty. Outside, wind rattled the shutters she'd reinforced last month. Winter coming on fast this year. She'd need to bring in more wood, maybe butcher one of the older chickens for preserving. Always something needing doing when you work the land alone. A wolf howled somewhere up the mountain, answered by another. Martha listened without fear. She knew every sound this mountain made. The scream of wildcats, the rustle of deer browsing, the way wind sang different through pine and aspen. These were her companions now, more reliable than people with their judgment and expectations. Still, as she banked the fire and prepared for bed, Tom Harper's words nagged at her. New preachers stirring up old prejudices, men drinking and talking about what wasn't their business. She'd faced down worse, but she wasn't fool enough to ignore a warning from a decent man. Behind her calico curtain, Martha undressed and slipped into her nightgown. The bed felt vast and cold as always, but she'd long stopped expecting it to feel otherwise. Some might pity her for sleeping alone these 7 years, but they didn't understand the peace of it. No demands on her body or heart, no risk of loss that cut so deep it near killed you too. She lay listening to the night sounds, one hand resting on the rifle she'd propped beside the bed. Tomorrow she'd ride to town, despite it not being her usual day. Best to show her face, remind them she was just a woman making her way, not some story to frighten children or tempt fools. But tonight, she was safe in her solitude. Her empty bed a choice rather than a burden. Let them talk down in Copper Creek. Martha Brennan had survived worse than wagging tongues. She'd carved out her place on this mountain with sweat and stubbornness, and no preacher or whiskey-brave fool would drive her from it. The moon rose full through her single window, flooding the cabin with silver light. In that light, the empty spaces seemed less like absence and more like possibility, room to breathe, to be, to exist, without explaining or apologizing. Martha closed her eyes, pulling the wedding ring quilt up to her chin. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, she slept as she'd slept these 7 years, alone, but on her own terms. The October wind cut sharp across the valley as Samuel McKenna guided his horse through the herd, counting head one last time before driving them to the lower pasture. At 43, he'd been working cattle longer than half the men in the county had been alive, and his weathered face showed every hard winter and dry summer. "That's 312, he called to his hired hand, young Pete Olson. "Same as yesterday." Pete nodded, pulling his coat tighter. "Getting cold early this year, Mr. McKenna. Reckon we'll see snow before November?" "Likely so." Sam squinted at the heavy clouds building over the western peaks. 22 years he'd been reading this sky, learning its moods like a man might learn his wife's expressions, though he'd only had 8 years to learn Clara's before the accident took her and little Emma both. The memory still caught him sideways sometimes, sharp as that October wind. Clara's laugh, the way Emma would run to meet him when he came in from the range. All of it gone in one terrible moment when her horse spooked at a rattler, sending the buggy over the cliff edge. "Mr. McKenna?" Pete's voice pulled him back. "You want me to start moving them?" Quote, "Go ahead. I'll catch up." Sam watched the boy ride off, eager and green as Sam himself had been once, before the war, before Clara, before he learned how much a man could lose and still keep breathing. These days, folks in Copper Creek called him a hard man. And maybe they were right. He worked from dawn past dusk, spoke little, smiled less. What was there to smile about when you came home to an empty house? His spread, the rocking M, sat 4 miles north of town, bordered on one side by Tom Harper's Double J, and on the other by the mountain where that peculiar Brennan woman lived alone. Sam had seen her a few times in town, a handsome woman in a plain way, keeping to herself as much as he did. Folks talked about her too, though different than they talked about him. A man alone was just ornery. A woman alone was unnatural. By the time Sam and Pete got the cattle settled, the sun was dropping low. Pete headed to the bunkhouse while Sam tended his horse. The familiar ritual of brushing and feeding was more comfort than chore. The barn smelled of hay and leather, an honest scent that asked nothing of him. "Getting too old for this," he muttered to his gelding buck, who snorted in what might have been agreement. Sam's back ached from 12 hours in the saddle, his hands stiff with cold. Time was he'd thought about selling out, moving to California or Oregon, starting fresh. But this land held Clara and Emma, buried in the small plot behind the house. How could he leave them? Inside, Sam built up the fire and heated last night's stew. The place was clean but sparse, a man's space without any softening touches. Clara's things he'd packed away that first year, unable to bear seeing her sewing basket or Emma's rag doll. Now the house felt more like a bunkhouse where he happened to sleep than a home. He ate standing by the window, watching darkness creep across his land. Good grazing ground. Water rights secured. Buildings solid. A legacy for no one. His brother back in Missouri had sons, but they were town boys. Wouldn't know a branding iron from a fence post. After supper, Sam sat by the fire with the old newspaper from town, reading about beef prices and railway expansion. Anything to fill the silence. He'd tried keeping a dog once, but when it died of snakebite, the loss hit harder than it should have. Better to need nothing. No one. The next morning brought frost and the kind of crystal air that made the mountains seem close enough to touch. Sam worked alongside Pete, mending fence and checking water holes. The boy chatted about the dance coming up at the Grange Hall, which girls might attend, whether his saved wages would buy a new shirt. "You planning to go, Mr. McKenna?" Sam snorted. "Dancing's for young fools. Weren't you young once?" "Different times." Sam had danced plenty with Clara, her yellow hair flying as he spun her to fiddle music. That man felt like a stranger now, someone who had believed in happiness lasting. Pete wisely dropped the subject, though Sam caught him sneaking glances like he was trying to picture his stern boss as a young man courting. That afternoon, Tom Harper rode over on business. They stood by the corral discussing plans for the spring drive to the railhead. What outfit to hire for the chuck wagon, whether to pool their herds for better prices. Martha Brennan came to town yesterday, Tom mentioned casual-like, caused quite a stir at the church meeting. Sam kept his eyes on the horses. "That's so?" Reverend Dalton tried to lecture her about proper Christian living for women. She told him she'd been living proper for 7 years without his guidance and didn't need it now. Despite himself, Sam felt his mouth twitch. Bet that went over well, like a rattler in a church picnic. But she stood her ground, even when some of the biddies started clucking. Woman's got sand, I'll give her that. Sam had heard the stories about Martha Brennan, how she'd buried her family and kept to herself since. He understood that choice, the safety of solitude. Though a woman faced risks, a man didn't. Living alone, The world wasn't kind to those who didn't fit its expectations. After Tom left, Sam found himself thinking about the Brennan woman as he worked, both of them choosing isolation over the risk of caring again. Did she wake at night reaching for someone who wasn't there? Did she talk to her animals just to hear a voice? Even her own fool thoughts, he muttered, attacking the woodpile with unnecessary force. What business was it of his how another person managed grief? But that night, as he sat with his empty plate in silent rooms, Sam couldn't shake the image of another soul eating supper alone. Maybe 4 miles as the crow flies, but a lifetime away in all the ways that mattered. He'd built these walls around himself, board by board, season by season. They kept the herd out, sure enough, but they kept everything else out too. The first storm warning came 3 days later, temperature dropping fast, clouds building heavy and dark. Sam and Pete worked fevered to prepare, moving the cattle to sheltered areas, securing loose equipment, bringing in extra feed from the far barn. "Never seen clouds that color," Pete said nervously, "like a bruise over the whole sky." Sam studied the horizon, unease prickling his neck. In 22 years, he'd weathered some fierce storms, but something about this one felt different. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "Soon as we're done here, you head to town," he told Pete. "Stay at the boarding house until this blows over." "What about you?" "I'll be fine." Rode out worse than this, quote. But as Pete disappeared down the road and Sam battened down for the storm, he wondered if that was true. A man could ride out weather easy enough. It was the other storms, the ones that howled inside, where no walls could stop them, that wore you down winter by winter. The wind picked up as darkness fell, rattling windows and sending loose boards banging. Sam built the fire high and pulled on an extra shirt. Outside, Buck and the other horses stamped nervously in the barn. He'd check them once more before the worst hit, make sure they had water and calm feed. Standing in his doorway, Sam watched the first snow begin to fall, heavy flakes that meant business. Somewhere up on that mountain, Martha Brennan was watching the same storm roll in. Did she have enough wood split? Were her animals secured? Not his concern, he told himself firmly. They'd each chosen their solitary paths. But as the wind howled louder and the temperature plummeted, Sam couldn't quite convince himself that islands could stand alone forever. Even the strongest fence post could snap under enough pressure. Even the most carefully guarded heart might remember, in the depths of a killing storm, what warmth felt like. He closed the door against the wind and returned to his empty house to wait out whatever was coming. But for the first time in years, the silence felt less like peace and more like something that needed filling. Sam poured himself a whiskey and tried not to think about another soul, 4 miles away, facing the same storm alone. The storm hit with a fury Sam McKenna had never seen in all his years ranching. What started as heavy snow turned into a white wall of rage, the wind screaming like demons across the valley. He'd meant to wait it out safe in his house, but by midnight, the barn doors were banging fit to tear off their hinges. Cursing, Sam pulled on his heavy coat and wrapped a scarf tight around his face. The moment he stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked him flat. Snow drove horizontal, stinging, exposed skin like needles. He couldn't see the barn, though it stood not 30 feet away. Fighting for every step, Sam made it there and wrestled the doors secure. The horses were wild-eyed with fear, and he spent precious minutes calming them, checking their water hadn't frozen. By the time he started back, he could barely feel his fingers inside his gloves. That's when Buck broke free. The gelding burst through the stall gate. Sam hadn't latched proper in his haste, crashing out the side door into the storm. Without thinking, Sam lunged after him. A man didn't let his horse die in weather like this. Not a horse that had carried him faithful for 8 years. "Buck! Whoa, boy!" His voice vanished in the wind. Sam stumbled after the fleeing shadow, following broken snow trail and instinct. The world had shrunk to a few feet of swirling white, no landmarks, no direction, just the killing cold and the need to find his horse. He didn't know how long he searched. Time stopped meaning anything in that white hell. His legs grew heavy, stumbling more often. Ice built up on his scarf where his breath froze. Still, he pushed on, calling for Buck until his throat went raw. It was the gelding who found him, appearing out of the snow like a ghost, head down and sides heaving. Sam grabbed the halter with numb hands, nearly weeping with relief. But when he turned to head back, he realized the terrible truth. He had no idea which direction the ranch lay. They were lost in the blizzard, and the cold was winning. Sam knew better than to panic. Panic killed men faster than cold. He needed shelter, any kind of windbreak. Leading Buck, he stumbled forward, praying for a ravine, a stand of trees, anything. His boots had filled with snow, feet like blocks of ice. How long before frostbite? How long before he simply lay down and didn't get up again? Then he smelled smoke. Wood smoke, unless his mind was playing tricks. Sam turned into the wind, following that faint promise of warmth. Buck pressed close behind him, the horse knowing death when it breathed down its neck. Then, like salvation itself, a faint glow appeared through the white. A window. A lit window, meaning life and shelter from the storm. Sam stumbled to the door, barely able to lift his fist to pound on the heavy wood. "Hello? Anyone there? Please?" For a terrible moment, nothing. Then the scrape of a bar lifting, and the door cracked open. A woman's face appeared, eyes wide with shock. Martha Brennan, rifle in hand, staring at him like he was a ghost. "Please," Sam managed through frozen lips, "my horse." She looked past him to where Buck stood shivering, then back to Sam's ice-covered face. Whatever she saw there decided her. The door opened wide. "Get in here before you freeze to death." Sam didn't remember much of the next few minutes. Martha taking Buck's reins, leading the horse to the small lean-to attached to her cabin, her strong hands helping him inside, sitting him by the fire, the agony of feeling returning to his fingers and toes. "Drink this." She pressed a cup of something hot into his hands, coffee laced with whiskey that burned down his throat. "What in God's name were you doing out in this?" Quote, "Horse got loose." His voice came out rough, got turned around. "You're lucky you found my place." Another 10 minutes. She didn't finish, busy pulling off his frozen boots. Sam wanted to protest, to say he could manage, but his hands were shaking too hard. "Your feet are bad," Martha said matter-of-factly as she examined his toes. "Not frozen through, but close. This is going to hurt." She was right. As she rubbed, feeling back into his feet, the pain was like being burned alive. Sam gritted his teeth, gripping the chair arms. Martha worked steady and sure, knowing hands that had done this before. "There's dry clothes in that trunk," she said, nodding to a corner. "They were my husband's. You need to get out of those wet things." Sam hesitated. Taking a dead man's clothes felt wrong somehow. But Martha had turned away, busying herself at the stove, giving him privacy. Survival won over propriety. The clothes were worn but clean, smelling faintly of cedar. They fit well enough, though the man must have been broader through the shoulders. "Thank you," Sam said when he was dressed. The words felt too small for saving his life. Martha set a bowl of stew in front of him. "Eat. You need to warm up from the inside, too." They sat in silence while Sam ate, the storm raging outside. The cabin was small, but tight-built, wind finding no cracks to whistle through. He noticed things as his mind thawed. Herbs hanging from the rafters, books on a shelf, everything neat and ordered, a woman making a life alone. Same as him, but different. "Your horse will be all right," Martha said finally. "I gave him some grain, rubbed him down. That lean-to's small but solid. I'm grateful for everything. I know showing up like this. You showed up dying." Her gray eyes were steady on his. "I wouldn't turn away a rabid wolf in this weather, much less a neighbor." Neighbor. They'd lived 4 miles apart for years and never spoken beyond a nod in town. Sam studied her face in the firelight. Not pretty in the conventional way, but strong, lined by sun and sorrow. He wondered if his own face told the same story. "I should bed down in the barn," he said as he finished eating. "I've imposed enough." Martha looked at him like he'd suggested jumping off a cliff. That lean-to barely fits your horse. You'd freeze before morning. Then I'll sit by the fire. Mr. McKenna, her voice held a note of exasperation. This storm's not letting up tonight. We're both grown people who've buried spouses. I think we can manage to be practical about sleeping arrangements without scandal. She was right. Of course she was. Still, Sam felt awkward as Martha efficiently set about making up a pallet by the fire with blankets from her trunk. You take the bed, he said firmly. This is your home, and you're the one, half frozen. But she didn't argue further, disappearing behind the curtain that sectioned off the sleeping area. Sam settled on the pallet, feeling every one of his 43 years. The fire crackled warm, the wind howled outside, and he was alive when he shouldn't be, all because he'd stumbled to the right door. Mrs. Brennan, he called softly. Thank you for opening the door. I know what folks say about you living alone. You took a risk. There was silence from behind the curtain. Then, folks say plenty about both of us, Mr. McKenna. Doesn't make it true. Sam stared at the fire shadows on the ceiling. Here they were, two people who'd chosen isolation, forced together by a storm. He thought about Tom Harper's words, about Martha standing up to the Reverend. The woman had courage. That was certain. My wife died in an accident, he found himself saying. Her and our daughter both, 8 years ago. I'm sorry, the words came soft from the darkness. I lost my husband and 3 children to fever. 7 years back, Martha said quietly. 3 children. Sam closed his eyes. One had nearly killed him. How did someone survive 3? That why you stay up here alone? That's why. A pause. You same. I reckon easier than risking it again. They fell quiet, but it was a different silence than Sam was used to. Not empty, but full of understanding. Two people who knew the weight of loss, sharing space while a killer storm raged outside. Sleep came slow. Sam listened to the wind, the fire settling, the small sounds of another person breathing nearby. How long since he'd slept under the same roof as another soul? The strangeness of it kept him wakeful, but underneath was something else. Comfort, maybe. The animal reassurance of not being alone in the dark. Sometime before dawn, the wind began to ease. Sam dozed fitful, waking when Martha rose to tend the fire. She moved quiet, trying not to disturb him, but he sat up anyway. Storm's passing, she said, not looking at him in the dim light. Her face seemed younger, softer. I'll leave at first light. Get out of your way. Martha turned then, and something in her expression made his chest tight. You're not in my way, Mr. McKenna, but I know you'll go anyway. We both will. Do what we must to keep our walls up. She understood. Of course she did. They were alike in this, choosing safety over connection, ghosts over the living. Sam wanted to say something, to acknowledge the strange bond of this night, but words had never been his strong suit. Instead, he simply nodded. When dawn came gray and still, he'd take his horse and return to his empty house. Martha would bar her door again, and they'd go back to being strangers who happened to share a valley. The storm had forced them together, but storms always passed. For now, though, they sat by the fire while snow fell soft outside, two souls who'd forgotten the simple comfort of not being alone. It wouldn't last, couldn't last, given who they'd become. But for these few hours before dawn, it was enough.